We're about to learn a really revolutionary concept that the Rebbe is going to teach us in Rashi's explanation of the beginning of Parshas Voeira. What is the opening message and theme of the Parsha? Two opinions that Rashi shares with us, and in doing so, shows that there's a totally unexpected way to understand the pshat of a pasuk. So, ala psukim shebetchilas Parsha Seinu, commenting on a variety of psukim at the beginning of our Parsha, Voeira Avram b'gomer, the pasuk that says that Hashem tells Moshe that I appeared to Avram, and I kept my promise to them, etc. Hebi Rashi Shnei Pirushim. So over a few psukim, Rashi brings two explanations. Allah first he tells us, Toichem psukim elu hu hakdama li psukim dehalon. This Voeira is an introduction to the psukim that will follow, which is I heard the complaints of the Jewish people. Therefore you should tell them that I'm going to take them out. Says Rashi, because Hashem had already promised Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and he made a covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, and he had till that point not fulfilled the promise. Therefore here Hashem says, this is what I'm about to talk about. I spoke to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and made them a promise. Here's going to be the beginning of the fulfillment of that promise. I heard the cries of the Jewish people, and I remember that covenant. Therefore tell the Jewish people the good news, they're going out of Mitzrayim. In other words, the introduction to the next piece that Rashi identifies is that now Hashem will fulfill the promises he made to the Avos. That's one line of explanation. Rashi gives another base. But Rabbi that there is a medrash that says actually Voeira Avram refers back to what was mentioned previously at the end of Parsha Shmois. Shama Moshe Lama Hariosa. When Moshe complained to the Eibishter and said, "Why have you made things worse for the Jewish people since you sent me here?" In other words, unlike the first explanation that says these psukim are the introduction to what will follow, this explanation says these psukim actually relate back to something that was already said. And then this is part of the Eibishter's response to Moshe's complaint, why have you made things worse for the Jewish people? And in that, in that the Eibishter highlights the greatness of the Avos. They didn't ask me for a name, as you, Moshe, did. When they had things that didn't seem to go according to the promises made to them, they didn't question. Moshe, whereas Moshe, you did ask what name should I convey to the Jewish people, and Lama Hariosa, you did complain about the way that I conduct things. So that explanation links it back to, so to speak, the Eibishter addressing Moshe's complaints. On Mamshech Rashi, then, this is going to be a very interesting part of our conversation. Rashi then continues, after giving us that second explanation, and says, this medrash that I've just quoted doesn't really settle nicely within the words of the pasuk itself. For a variety of reasons that Rashi spells out. And Rashi effectively raises two questions. It doesn't say in the pasuk that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov didn't ask for my name, whereas Rashi is actually saying that's what the Medrash teaches. And also the flow doesn't seem to really work well. So he asks these two questions, and then Rashi concludes as follows, and we need to pay attention to these words. Therefore I say, let's keep the pasuk with its simplest explanation. Davar aloif nov, like the pasuk in Mishlei, that just keep things as they are stated. And those who want to explore further in the world of Medrash may do so. Because the pasuk tells us, the Eibishter says, my words are like fire, like a hammer that shatters a boulder, and it breaks up into many sparks. Okay, it would appear at first glance that what Rashi wants us to know is effectively two things. Number one, the fact that he's saying this medrash doesn't really suit the pshat, obviously he's telling us it's not the best way to explain the simplest understanding of the pasuk. And if he shames it, because it doesn't fit nicely with the words and the flow and the context. Now, Rashi has told us many times that his intention is to tell us the pshat. This doesn't really fit well with the pshat. And generally he'd only quote something midrashic if it is directly related to the pshat. So that's why here he's saying I'm not comfortable with this medrash because it doesn't really fit the pshat. And Beis Lidach Gis at the same time, on the other hand, Rashi, but at the same time, Rashi wants to be clear. Just because I'm saying this medrash doesn't fit well with the pasuk, doesn't mean I reject the principle of medrash. Go ahead and learn medrash; it's a good thing. Because Torah has many channels and approaches, like the like the hammer that smashes the stone. And if you do go down the drasha route, the medrash route, you will actually find a good explanation. Okay, so Rashi seems to be settling to say, I don't really think this medrash fits nicely with the pshat of the pasuk, but medrash has its place in Yiddishkeit and should be learned. Problem is this, there's actually quite some important questions to raise over here. Quote number one, when does Rashi do that? Quote something and say, but I don't agree with it. It's completely out of character for Rashi to quote a source and then say, but I don't feel the source is really that valid. Rashi's approach usually is, he'll only tell us the information that is directly related to the pshat, and should there be another interpretation that doesn't fit the pshat, he just won't mention it. Whereas here he breaks from protocol. He gives us all the detail of what the medrash says. And immediately after that, he explains why he doesn't really accept it as something that fits with the words of the pasuk. Why is Rashi doing this? Beis, second of all, even if for whatever reason Rashi feels it really necessary to tell us here at this point, and that's going to be our question, why is it here at this point, that if you have an explanation that doesn't fit comfortably in the pshat, it's still valid within Torah, because as he's told us, Torah breaks up into many different channels and all of them are valid. Rashi should have told us the first time he told us the rules of how you interpret Torah. Where Rashi told us right at the beginning of Bereshis, I'm not going to quote midrashim that do not fit nicely with the pshat. And there he could have told us, and there are other equally valid streams, I'm just not going to quote them. Befrat. Would it be the most suitable place for Rashi to give us this information in Bereshis, because he does tell us other relevant information about how you learn Medrash? Yes, Midrash he immediately tells us there are many Midrashim. Here's where you can find them. But my job is not to go into the world of Medrash, but rather just to tell you the simple explanation of the pasuk. And I'll borrow a Medrash. I'll borrow a Medrash when it helps us understand the pshat better. And that could have been B'dayim L'Shen Rashi Kan. He actually could have used very similar language to what he uses over here. That's where Rashi should have given us this rule that he's just told us now, that Hadrosha Yidorish, sometimes it's best to go look at the Medrash and it's also valid. And he could have told us, he could have there concluded with the same message as over here, which is that the Torah splits up into many different types of explanation, all of which are valid, and most of which do not belong in Rashi. Why is Rashi bringing it here? And why is Rashi quoting an explanation and then essentially rejecting it? Okay, so let's try and answer this. But Pashtas, yesh leforish. Shatam shevi Rashi pirush Rabbi Seinuhu. Well, the simplest answer why Rashi is quoting a medrash would be like Rashi always quotes a medrash. If the pshat answer leaves us with questions, we need something to address those questions. Must be that Rashi is quoting the Medrash because it will resolve some questions that will linger after we have seen the explanation according to Pshat. What questions would we have? Well, we'd actually have some serious questions, because those 4 words right at the beginning of the Parsha that say, and the Eibishter spoke to Moshe, Pirish Rashi identifies on the word Vayidaber, which is a harsh language, and Elokim, which is the Eibishter in the role of Voeira. Rashi says that the Eibishter is speaking harshly and almost judgmentally to Moshe Rabbeinu over the fact that he had questions, why have you done bad to the Jewish people? When Rashi gives that explanation, he doesn't attach it to a medrash, implying the simplest way to understand that is that Hashem is reprimanding Moshe at that point. Or if he's a nimtza, which would then imply that the first comment that Rashi says, שהאמיר ויאמר אליו ואיר גוימר אין ההמשך לנמר לאם למה הריוסה אלא הקדמה לנמר אלון וגם אני שמעתי גוימר לכן אמר גוימר. The first explanation we looked at over here, which is Rashi saying the opening psukim of this parsha are to introduce us to what's going to continue in the rest of the parsha, not to link back to the previous parsha. Then we have a big question. In Arba Teves Halolu, these 4 words, Vaidaber Elokim El Moshe, which Rashi explains is linked back to Parsha Shmois, and Inyan Bifnei Atzmai must be independent of the rest of the opening statements of Parshas Voeira. And they are still linked to Moshe's complaints in the end of last Parsha. Now, that's a very difficult explanation to swallow. Shekain, for 2 reasons. First reason is really the pasuk should have been Vaidaber Elokim El Moshe end, and then Vayomer Lo Ani Hashem, etc. Because the first part of the pasuk really belongs to and is attached to the end of the previous parsha, whereas the second part of the pasuk from the words Vayomer Elo Ani Hashem, that's where the introduction to what's happening next should come. So logic says that pasuk should have actually been 2 psukim. But besides that, Hare, straight after Moshe raised his concerns, why have you made life difficult for the Jewish people after you sent me? The Eibishter immediately addresses that and responds, now you'll see that I'm going to honor my commitments and I'm going to sort it out. So it's already been dealt with. So now we have a big question. Why would the Torah take 4 words, and split it, break it off from the flow of the conversation that apparently this reprimand is part of? Moshe complains, the Eibishter responds, and then we get told how or what kind of mood the Eibishter shared with Moshe. Right? Mishpat. Why are you splitting it? And you're going to put that Vaidaber Elokim El Moshe in a different segment of Torah, which is actually a different parsha in the Chumash. Why would you do that? Maybe that's the reason why Rashi had to bring a medrash, because there's this glaring question about how we're understanding the pshat flow, that there's this mix-up and mash-up at the beginning of the parsha of information that belongs to the previous story and information that introduces the next story, and it's all in one pasuk. So therefore he has to give us another alternative. So the medrash helps, because the medrash says, well, actually the next few psukim are not just simply an introduction to what follows, but they're also part of the conversation from last week's parsha. Because this is actually the detail of what the reprimand from Hashem was to Moshe. Why did you speak? Why did you ask questions? Why were you not like the others? Okay? Sounds like a great reason to explain why Rashi gave a pshat and then went to a medrash. But once you look at this closely, it's actually not an answer. Because Rashi tells us clearly, the medrash does not work nicely within the flow of the sentences and the words within those sentences. Now, you're proposing that the reason Rashi quotes the medrash is because we have a problem with the words, and then he tells us, but this medrash doesn't solve the problem with the words, and that cannot be the reason he brought the medrash. Rashi is effectively telling us that the issues with marrying this medrash to the pshat is so overwhelming that there's actually no way you could say that this medrash fits with pshat. Because even though it might answer some other niggling questions that we have, but it doesn't work with the pshat. Which takes us back to our original question. Why would Rashi mention at all, and then not only at all, but in so much detail, what the Medrash perspective is? So when Rashi knows he's not going to accept it as the explanation. Now there are numerous occasions, including 5 different times in Sefer Bereshis, So, in other words, before this Parsha, where Rashi says there is a medrash, it's not necessarily going to fit nicely with the pshat, but it will address an issue in the pshat. I'm not going to take the medrash as an explanation of the pshat, even though it will help us get our heads around questions we have on the pshat. Then Rashi will say it in a simpler way. There are various midrashim, in other words, teasing us to go and look and see what the medrash has to say if we have those questions. As we find in many places, as mentioned 5 times before this parasha. In none of those scenarios does Rashi actually quote the medrash and say, but it doesn't fit the pshat. Why here? Now, before we can get into any of that, let's analyze the very last statement that Rashi made, because it also seems to be a very bizarre statement, and for that reason, there are 3 different interpretations of what Rashi was actually trying to tell us. B'sim divrei Rashi hanal v'adrosha tidorish. Rashi concludes by saying, you want to darshan, go ahead, read the medrash, it's all fine. Because the Eibishter says, my words are like fire. And the pasuk continues that it's like a hammer shattering a boulder. That splits up into many sparks. Dorish bir. We need to understand what breaks over here. That it breaks up into multiple or myriad sparks. There's a 3-way debate. What is it that scatters and shatters? The simplest explanation is we're talking about the boulder that gets whacked with the hammer, and therefore it breaks apart. Like a hammer that shatters a boulder. The simplest way to understand it is that the boulder is broken into smithereens because of the tool that smashes it. That's exactly how Rashi explains it in Gemara. When this conversation comes up in Gemara Shabbos, he says, Ma patish mischalek hasela al yodoy lekamani tzotzos. That's exactly the words that he uses. The nature is that when you take this heavy sledgehammer and you smash it against the rock will break up into pieces. That's the simplest way. It's not the only interpretation. There's another interpretation, the exact opposite. The second explanation is that the hammer breaks because of the strength of the rock that it's trying to hit. And that's actually how some people read what Rashi is supposed to say. Like the language of the Gemara, the patish mischale gets broken up. And as we're talking about this really solid rock that breaks the tool which was intended to break it. So those 2 opinions you probably could have guessed. The third opinion is really surprising. Yes, it is about the hammer, according to the third opinion, the hammer hitting the stone, but neither the stone breaks nor the hammer breaks. Rather, we're describing the sparks that fly from the hammer when the hammer hits against the harsh surface of the rock. Now, truth is, all 3 explanations really leave us with a question. The first explanation, which is the hammer breaks the rock. The question is, okay, picture the scene. There's this boulder smashing into tiny pieces. Why is Rashi calling that sparks? Should call it shards. Sparks is a term that you use to describe things that come from something that is a source of heat or light. Why didn't Rashi just say it breaks up into multiple tiny little pieces? The second explanation is definitely not the simplest way to interpret this. Because the truth is, the nitzotzes question is still valid, even if you say it's the hammer that's breaking. But there's 2 other issues over here. Aleph, leforish biloshen kapatish yefoitzet sela. To take those words, ke, like, patish, a hammer, yefoitzet sela, breaking a stone, and then explain it, shapatish mispoitzetz alidei sela, that it actually means this, the hammer is breaking. That is the exact opposite of the simplest way you would interpret that pasuk. Especially looking at the version of Rashi we have, where he doesn't have the quotation from the Gemara in our version of Rashi to say, just like a hammer against stone would break, so too words of Torah split up into many different variations. There's no way you could suggest that Rashi, whose entire life is dedicated to explaining things in the simplest and clearest way, in his interpretation, intended to clarify things, would write, Aleph, write a statement that leaves us questioning what exactly does it mean, just like the hammer hitting the stone makes many sparks. And it's definitely unthinkable that Rashi would actually expect us to interpret the pasuk in the exact opposite way of the pshat. Not Rashi, maybe somebody else. Secondly, if we are going to go with the second explanation, which says that the hammer cracks, Rashi should have given us some insight and said it's a really hard stone. And it's not like any normal stone that would shatter under the force of the hammer. And he doesn't tell us that. Even the third interpretation isn't so clear because let's be honest, it's really, if we're concerned that the pshat about hitting the hammer onto the rock is going to break the hammer, that's far-fetched, then it's also far-fetched to say that what's going to be produced is not broken stone or broken hammer, but sparks. Also, that word mischalek sounds like something that breaks apart, not something that sparks. Which brings, of course, the greatest question of all of these three interpretations, or the quotation that Rashi says, considering that Rashi always likes to write things in the clearest possible way. In a way that even a 5-year-old learning Torah for the first time would be able to appreciate. Why here is he leaving something so ambiguous? Leads it open to a 3-way debate, and we're not even sure what Rashi intended. Why would he do that? And just to highlight the extent of the question, when Rashi is explaining the Gemara Shabbos, he spelled out clearly how he understood this expression. He made it clear that it means that the boulder breaks under the force of the hammer. So surely he should have done the same when he's explaining Chumash, which is supposed to be much simpler. One last issue that we have to look at, and that is Rashi also seems to add information when he tells us about the versatility of Torah, information that didn't need to be there. When Rashi quotes a pasuk saying that it's like the hammer breaking the stone, he also included the beginning of the pasuk. The Eibusha says, "My words are like fire." What's that got to do with it? What has the fact that the Eibusha's words are like fire to do with what Rashi wants to express over here, which is that the Torah can be interpreted in multiple ways, all valid? Surely the only part of that pasuk that is relevant to Rashi's point about the diversity of Torah explanations is the part where the stone splits up, not the fact that Hashem's words are like fire. And an even bigger question on this, this exact principle, as we've already touched on very briefly, the idea that just like the stone can shatter into many pieces under the force of the hammer, so one concept in Torah can be split into many, many diverse opinions. We already mentioned that it's in the Gemara Shabbos. It's also in the Gemara Sanhedrin. And in Gemara Shabbos it doesn't say that every concept could be interpreted in many ways. Rather, it says that this is to teach us that every word that the Eibusha said at the time of the giving of the Torah was immediately transposed into all the 70 languages. Over Masechah Sanhedrin, closer to what we're talking about in Sanhedrin, it says Shemikra Echad Yotzei Kamatayim, a single pasuk could have many, many reasons behind it or many explanations of it. In both cases, The Gemara did not feel it necessary to quote the beginning of the pasuk, where the Eibishter says, "My words are like fire." Only the part that's directly relevant to what the message is of the Gemara, which is, it's like the stone smashing the bowl into smithereens. Now, it's interesting because there are two other places in the Gemara, and there it says this pasuk about smashing the stone in a completely different way. It says, if you encounter the Yetzer Hara, if the Yetzer Hara tries to interfere with your life, schlep him to the yeshiva, it will sort him out. If he is tough as iron, he will explode. Because the pasuk says, because there it's relevant for us to know that the words of Hashem are like fire. And it concludes the pasuk also like a hammer smashing a stone. There it makes perfect sense why the Gemara would also include the part of the pasuk that Hashem's words are like fire. Why is it worthwhile? Why is it effective to schlep the Yetzer Hara to the Beis Medrash, to the yeshiva? It's because if he is iron, he'll be destroyed. He kipirish Rashi Sham. What does it mean he'll be destroyed? Says Rashi, because Torah is like fire that will melt the iron. So if the message of the Gemara is that the fire of Torah will melt the power of the Yetzer Hara, then it makes sense to quote the part of the pasuk that tells us Torah is like fire. But in our conversation, all we want to know is that one idea in Torah can split into many, many sub-ideas and channels and perspectives. Why? Surely we don't need the beginning of the pasuk. Why does Rashi quote it? And finally, when we compare what Rashi says over here to a very similar conversation Rashi has with us all the way back in Parshas Vayishlach, it also raises further questions about how Rashi is interpreting things over here. Let's do a comparison between Rashi's explanation here and in Parshas Vayishlach. What happens in Parshas Vayishlach? Also, two versions of how you interpret a pasuk, and Rashi says there are possible options. So, Allah pasuk Vayikra Loi Keila Lekei Yisrael Yaakov Avinu builds a mizbeach, and then the pasuk says, and he called it Keil Elokei Yisrael. Hevi Rashi Shnei Pirushim. Rashi gives two explanations. Echol Dad Derech HaPshat. The first explanation is the simplest explanation, and then a Pirush Noisav Sherabi Seinu Dorshu. And then he gives one according to the Drash. So the simplest explanation is not that the Mizbeach is named God, but rather the Mizbeach is a tribute to the fact that the Eibishter helped and looked after Yaakov. Medrash, that at this point the Eibishter called Yaakov Kel. And then Umasayim, Rashi concludes, exactly like he says over here. The words of the Torah are like that boulder smashed by the hammer. Mischalkim lekama, and that could be diversified into many different explanations. Vani leyashev pshutishal mikra basi. My job, says Rashi, is just to satisfy the simplest explanation. There's Rashi saying the same comment as here without quoting the beginning of the pasuk. All right. You can see there Rashi is doing what he normally does, keeping things as simple and clear as possible. He explains what the mashal means, that an idea within Torah can split into many different explanations and reasons. And of course he's using that expression to clarify how divrei Torah work. And there you can now marry the message, the nimshal, with the simplest understanding of the mashal, which is the hammer is breaking the stone. Rashi doesn't have to explain that because it's obvious. The hammer breaks the stone into many, many smithereens, and that's exactly what happens with Torah. One idea gets split up into many, many perspectives. And in Beis, if he leaves out the first part of the pasuk, which makes a lot of sense, that my words are like fire, says Hashem. He only quotes the words that are directly relevant, which is like the stone smashed by the hammer. Why doesn't Rashi do that? You have Im Kain. It really raises the question about our Parsha. Why here is Rashi giving a different kind of interpretation on what looks like it's the same message that he gave in Parshas Vayishlach. Here he doesn't say that the words of Torah are split up into many words or many perspectives or many reasons. Here he says it splits into many sparks. Instead of telling us what the mashal means, Rashi continues explaining the mashal. Which leaves us with the ambiguity. So what exactly broke in the mashal? Because he doesn't tell us. And then why also does he include the beginning of the pasuk where he says, "My words," Hashem says, "of Torah are like fire." And it's in that particular area that we start to find an answer. Because the reason Rashi quotes the beginning of the pasuk is directly linked to the reason why he doesn't spell out the mashal in our pirush, and that's going to help us understand what Rashi intends to achieve over here. The one difference between Vayishlach explains the other. By examining the two distinctions between how Rashi explains things here versus in Vayishlach, which is the firstly, the fact that he adds the first half of the pasuk, which he didn't do in Vayishlach. And here he specifically writes that it's splitting up into many sparks. Rashi is doing that so he can clarify what he actually wants to tell us over here. That expression that it diversifies or breaks up or splits up in this particular conversation, it's not like in the Gemara, and it's not like in Parshas Vayishlach. It's not describing the stone and how the stone breaks, or the other version of how the hammer breaks. It's describing the nature of fire. That's why the fire is included. That part of the pasuk is included, because that's what's mischalek, what breaks up into sparks, which is actually now quite logical, because sparks do come from fire. Because it is obviously the simplest thing in the world to say, if the product is sparks, the cause is fire, not a stone. Stones don't become sparks, neither do hammers. So what's Rashi trying to tell us? As we've already touched on, Rashi's intention is to tell us this. The Eibishter wants us to know that his words are like fire. Torah is compared to fire. So says Hashem, and fire operates like a hammer. Fire is compared to a hammer that smashes a stone. In the same way as the hammer breaks the stone into many pieces, that is now mashal for the first part of the pasuk. The fire described in this pasuk, which is words of Torah, also splits up into not pieces but sparks. Why over here is that Rashi's focus, unlike in Parshas Vayishlach, where he was happy to say that it's a stone breaking into pieces to describe the many perspectives of Torah, and here he's specifically telling us it's fire breaking into sparks, which is similar to the stone breaking up under the force of the hammer. There he was happy just to say it's like a stone. It's because, and here we're about to enter into the space of the great bombshell the Rebbe is going to teach us from this Rashi. Here there's a whole new perspective. A whole unique, never seen before connection or relationship between the simplest understanding of the pasuk and the medrash understanding of a pasuk. And Rashi wants to draw our attention to this revolutionary, new type of understanding of Torah we've never seen before. The best way to describe the surprising approach that the Torah is taking over here is to speak about fire splitting into sparks rather than stones breaking down into shards. So what's Rashi trying to tell us over here? Let's go back to Rashi's whole message, which we questioned. Quote a midrash, then tell us it doesn't really fit the pshat, and then tell us about Rashi Yidorish. What's his message? Rashi's intention when he said, he's saying, let's leave the pshat as pshat and go experience drasha elsewhere or even here, but know that you're in the world of drash. That comment of Rashi, let's not understand it as superficially as we did before. That Rashi is defending and saying something is medrash and it doesn't exactly fit the pasuk, but don't worry, it's still valid Torah. What's Rashi teaching us that we don't already know? Here's the chiddush. Rashi is showing us that in this particular scenario, the pshat message of the pasuk is also, in addition to what it's telling us according to pshat, is also telling us you have to look further into the world of drash. In other words, we do see that Rashi uses something similar in other places. Rashi says, this pasuk is telling us the only way to understand it is you have to use drash. But here Rashi is telling us something fundamentally different. Because when Rashi says that he's saying the pasuk is telling us there is no satisfactory pshat interpretation. You can only understand this through the eyes of medrash. But here he's doing something else. Right? So in all of those scenarios, Rashi is saying you're not going to find joy in just the pshat. You have to engage the medrash. But on the pasuk didan here, Rashi is doing something totally different. Rashi is alerting us to a whole new way of understanding a pasuk. The whole Torah until this point has not yet had a scenario where this is how you learn the pasuk. What's the way to learn the pasuk? Yes, there is a valid pshat to understand this pasuk. Not only is it valid, but it's the best way to understand the pasuk, and therefore Rashi will list it as the first explanation. And the reason it's the best way to explain it is because it works with the language and it fits the language. Mikol Mokim, says Rashi, nevertheless, yet while you learn that pshat, which is valid, that pshat says, but you can't stop here, you have to also incorporate drash. There's a need for drash. In other words, once we understand what the pshat is, that's what compels us. The pshat will force us to appreciate that there are two key elements to understanding this pasuk. Both pshat, so normally Rashi just says pshat and you can learn medrash on your own, and drash, but it's not one of these cases where you're stuck without the drash. The pshat works, and you have to have the drash as well. My time in my drash is a medrash. And that's why Rashi brings us measured, even though the medrash doesn't really work nicely with the words and the context. Because Rashi is telling us the medrash doesn't fit nicely with the psukim, but I'm not rejecting it. Because the message of the medrash is relevant and valid, and we're going to keep it as part of how we understand the pasuk. What does that mean? In all the other places around the Torah where Rashi says there are many midrashim to look into. Rashi is essentially giving us homework and saying, look, the pshat is going to leave you with some questions. It's not my job to address those questions, but the medrash does so. Please look in the medrash. Which effectively is Rashi saying, were it not for this particular question about the pshat, there'd be nothing compelling you to read the medrash. And because Rashi is referring us in all of those instances to midrashim that don't really speak the language of the pasuk so clearly, but they just simply address a specific comment, a specific question in the medrash. So, there's no reason for Rashi to quote the medrash as part of his explanation of the pshat, because it's not an explanation of the pshat, it's only to resolve a question from the pshat. Our case is completely different. Yes, we know that the purpose of this medrash is to address questions that linger once you read the pshat. But besides that, the message of the Medrash is incredibly important to understanding what's going on over here in the Parsha, based on how you understand the Psukim. And that's going to take us back to those 4 words that seem misplaced in the Parsha, because that will stimulate a big question in the mind of the 5-year-old learning Chumash. When the child learned at the end of last week's Parsha that Moshe said to the Eibishter, why have you done negative, why have you made things worse for the Jewish people? And then the child realizes that the Eibishter is reprimanding Moshe for this. And then the child will remember, hey, I remember learning about Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They had many, many difficulties in their lives. And there's no record in the whole of the Torah that they ever complained to Hashem. The child says, well, it's obvious that the Eibishter must have said to Moshe, some kind of a message along the lines of, I'm afraid we lost the caliber of people of the Ovis. In fact, had the Eibishter not addressed this issue with Moshe and made the comparison to the Ovis, the child would have been really surprised. How is it that Eibishter is not saying anything about the fact that the Ovis accepted everything with absolute faith and Moshe's questioning? So therefore, once Rashi tells us, after Rashi tells us, yes, the Medrash over here doesn't really fit perfectly with the words. And therefore the Pshat should go with the first explanation, which is that these psukim are just introducing what's going to follow. There's still a question. Okay, you want to go with Pshat? The Pshat also forces us to ask that somehow Shakadosh Baruch Hu and Moshe divrei mishpat, that the Eibishter should have had some kind of a response, some kind of a judgment to Moshe for his questioning. Where? Why don't we see it anyway? Now you could say, well, we don't get every conversation that happened between Hashem and Moshe recorded in Torah Shebechsav. But look at the context. Here it says, "Vayedaber Elokim el Moshe diber itoi mishpat." This whole conversation is introduced with harsh language, and the Eibishter manifesting in a way of Elokim, it's words of mishpat. Not only that, and look how much detail we're getting in what was included in this conversation between Hashem and Moshe. At the end of Parsha Shmois, when Moshe Rabbeinu said, "Why have you done negative to the Jewish people?" the Eibishter said, "Now you'll see, I'm going to fulfill my promises." That is some form of reprimand, as Rashi actually says there. So if in Parsha Shmois the Torah detailed what kind of reprimand Hashem gave to Moshe, why not in this Parsha leave it just open-ended, which we know means that there was something harsh being said, and we don't know what? Especially when you consider that the Eibishter calling Moshe out for the fact that he questioned him is obviously a big deal. And it's even a bigger deal than in last week's Parsha. Why have you done bad? Where you could say, well, Moshe cares for the Yidden. Doesn't say it anywhere in the Pasuk. Doesn't tell us. That's what Rashi adds. That's what the Rashi says. Let's take the Pasuk at face value, at Pshat value, not face value, Pshat value. But the Pasuk is going to force us to look into the Medrash so we know what the nature of the criticism from Hashem to Moshe is. Seeing as the Psukim illustrate clearly to us that there had to have been some harsh conversation with Moshe. And the Torah alludes to the fact that this is happening by using the expression "Vayidaber Elokim el Moshe." The pshat of the pasuk is forcing us to look further to work out what happened. We need to look in a medrash. knowing the pshat of the story is the force for looking into the story behind the story, the drash. Kloimar, in other words, the simplest way to understand this psukim, pshat, is that there are two conversations between Hashem and Moshe here. There's what can be read and understood at a pshat level. The Eibush are telling Moshe, I'm now going to fulfill my promise, go speak to the Jewish people, tell them they're going to leave Mitzrayim. And then Beis, simultaneously, there's Divrei Mishpat, Hamarumos, Beis and Atevis, because of Api Adash. There are also these words of so-called judgment that are being alluded to in the pasuk. There is a conversation happening. The Torah is not spelling it out for us. It must be somewhere. Now we understand Rashi's introduced a new way of how to interpret psukim, where there's a pshat that drags out, that sends us into the world of Medrash. Basically, what Rashi is telling us is in every other place in Torah, you choose. Either you're going from the pshat or from the drush perspective. One entire approach is those explanations which are according to pshat and medrash that supports the pshat, which is all in the broader arena of simple understanding of the psukim. And that's they all belong in the volume of Torah called pshat. And anything that requires midrash without being there just simply to support the pshat belongs in the volume called drash. That's how it usually works. So if there's no explanation in pshat, Rashi sends it to the drash. If there's explanation in pshat, he doesn't bring a midrash unless it helps the pshat. But now we've suddenly got a whole a union, a harmony. We've got a hybrid of different modes of how you learn the Torah. It is an explanation which is required because of the pshat. But where will you find the explanation? Not in the pshat. You'll only find the explanation in the drash, even though the drash doesn't really fit so well with the words of the pshat. It's an incredible hybrid that we don't normally see. If you want to explain a whole new way of understanding Torah, you're going to need a whole different mashal. He has to bring a proof of this. So to that, Rashi tells us that the Eibishter's words are like fire, and that fire is that fire is like the boulder that splits into many pieces. Here, the fire splits into many sparks. As mentioned, Rashi is not describing what happens to the hammer, he's not describing what happens to the boulder, he's describing what happens to the fire itself, that it splits into all these different sparks. And there's a simple difference between shards of a boulder and sparks of a fire. Because the simplest explanation of the difference between a boulder that is shattered into smithereens and a fire that is broken into sparks. When you smash a boulder into many pieces, every one of those little pieces will be a different size, shape, weight, etc. But when sparks fly, to our eye, all of the sparks look the same. Both in terms of their scale and in terms of their quality. The human eye is incapable of seeing a difference between one spark and the next. They all look like sparks. The only difference between one spark and the next is which direction it flies. One goes west, one goes south. And it's exactly that point about Torah that Rashi wants to illustrate over here. One way that you understand Torah, which Rashi described in Parshas Vayishlach, is it's like hitting a stone, the stone smashes, and you have many different explanations. Each one is different. Which means that different ways to learn. Pshat doesn't look like drash, drash doesn't look like soid. They all look different, they all have a different shape, size, and weight, and that's all valid Torah. And that's exactly like the stone that has been broken, where the difference between the pieces of the stone is not just where they land up, but what they look like, how big they are, how heavy they are, etc. So one explanation fits with pshat, that's its size and shape, and the other fits with drash, which is its size and shape. As you see in Rashi's explanation there in Parshas Vayishlach on what it means when it says, and he called it Keilah Lekei Yisrael, one explanation, the pshat is that it's loy, what was called Keilah Lekei Yisrael, the Mizbeach. That he was naming the Mizbeach to remember the miracle that had happened to him. That's a simple way to understand things. Whereas it appears, the second explanation that Lo refers to Yaakov himself, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Kira Oile Yaakov Kel, Yeshtam Shel Drash. That's got a whole different feel to it. That doesn't feel like Pshat. That you're saying that the Eibishter called Yaakov Kel, that's far from Pshat. Looks different, sounds different, feels different. Ach Parsha Seinu Kan Moisif in our Parsha, a whole different story. Moisif Rashi Chidush Shamanu Klapei Kei Dvorai. Here we're learning a whole different interpretation, understanding, appreciation for what the Eibishter's words are like. So when the Eibishter's words split up into different channels, they're like sparks. Which means that the definition, or the so-called reasoning, or the so-called explanation is actually the same, even though one is pshat and the other one is drush. Because whether you're looking at the words in the pasuk, or whether you're looking at the backstory of what the Eibishter was telling Moshe, both of those are required by Pshat. They're both motivated by the same question. Which is very much like the sparks, where all the sparks pretty much look the same. It's just a question of where you're going to find the explanation. The spark, which is the explanation of Pshat, is found in this volume called the Pshat volume. In the simple understanding of the words. And the other perspective which consolidates this perspective, so it's the same kind of goal and explanation, it's just found in a different book. It's found in the volume of Drush. And that helps us to consolidate our understanding and appreciation of the fact that Torah is one Torah. What does that mean? When we say that the Torah is one, we're not just saying, well, it's one pasuk that has a whole lot of explanations, so the pasuk unifies all of the different explanations. And not only are they different explanations, but each explanation evolves into the next explanation. As we know, the 4 levels of how you learn Torah, Pshat, Remez, Drush, Soid, correspond to the 4 worlds of existence, Asiya, Yitzir, Bria, and Asiya. In the same way as Bria is an evolutionary process that emerges from Atzilus, so too, Remez is an evolutionary process that emerges from Soid, and so it goes. And therefore, obviously, whatever the Torah's explanations are, they must all align because they're all speaking about the same content, they all come from the same source, they all evolve into each other. Not only that. And it's not even good enough for us to say, if you take all the pieces of the Torah together as one big puzzle, you'll get the bigger picture. Similar to, take all the pieces of the human being, all the veins and sinews and organs and limbs, and put it all together, and then include into that all the various facets of the neshama, and then you get a human being, one finished puzzle. Likewise, the Torah, take all the pieces together, you get one Torah. It's far more profound than that. Even when I encounter each particular piece of Torah in its designated space, Pshat in Pshat, Medrash in Drush. So if I'm learning this particular part of Torah, I learn according to the rules that apply to that particular part of Torah. Because each part of Torah has its particular set of rules, how you're supposed to learn it. The fact is that because it's Torah, which means it's the Eibishter's words of fire. Fire is not something you could split up into pieces. So Torah cannot be split up into pieces. It's it's like the simplicity of fire being the single organic entity. Here's a piece of fire, there's another piece of fire. Therefore, we have to understand wherever we encounter a particular part of Torah and how we learn it according to the particular rules of that part of Torah, it is absolutely part of the rest of Torah. And you know where you see that most pronounced? That it's possible that an explanation required for the pshat of a pasuk is found in the drush of the Torah, because they are all one fundamentally united entity. That's a lesson for us when we learn Chassidus. When we're learning the neshama of Torah, we have to know that everything we're learning is absolutely one with the revealed parts of Torah, which is the so-called body of the Torah. As you find in various places, there's certain subjects in Nigla the Torah that you cannot understand without going into the Pnimis Torah. It just tells you, like Rashi says, it's the same kind of thing. The message is you're not going to understand this unless you go deeper. Nigla Torah gufa machriach pirush hashayich lenishmas deraisa. They're parts of Nigla the Torah that compel us to have to find an esoteric meaning. He has a great example. When we use anthropomorphic limb expressions to refer to Hashem, we know that can't be literal, and we have to look deeper. And the same applies in reverse. That sometimes there are concepts that you cannot understand in Chassidus or in Pnimis Torah until you know what's going on in Nigla. Like you find Arizal frequently explains things, even though it's Kisvei Arizal, which is outright Kabbalah, and explains things according to Pshat. When we learn every part of the Torah from the perspective that it is a single, unified Torah, that will help us that we should merit to learn immediately the Torah that Mashiach will teach us. Rambam tells us that Mashiach will teach Torah to the entire Jewish people, no matter who everybody is, no matter their stature, the Pshat people, the Soid people, all together, because it's Torah Achas, and that should be by Mehera, by Yameinu Mamash, immediately.